So, why am I comparing these two people? They're both late 19th, early 20th century British Methodists. It grows out of my book that I published just over a year ago, which was on British Methodist revivalism. And the final chapter of that was on Samuel Chadwick. He featured very prominently. And then I had this extra material on his understanding of social reform and social mission that I had to cut out of my book. And so then I used that for a paper last summer at the Oxford of Methodist Theological Studies. And then in the feedback on that, but I was comparing him with another person named Samuel Keeble. But the feedback on it from one of my colleagues there was that Lidgett would be a better comparison, and I kind of agreed. So I'm reworking it now, refining it, and comparing these two figures. But so it's a specific historical situation and debate. But as we'll see, I think you'll find the material and the debate is kind of still live in a sense. It feels very contemporary, the questions that they were wrestling with. So there was an unusual guest at the Southport Convention in July of 1909. The Southport Convention was a bastion of traditional holiness revivalistic teaching and theology. And the guest that year was John Scott Lidgett, who was not normally a person who would attend this kind of gathering. He was more of we could call a liberal evangelical. That's what they would have thought of themselves in those days. That seems like an oxymoron today, but it was a live tradition at the time. But he happened to be the president of the Wesleyan Methodist Conference that year. And in the British Methodist system, they have more like a Presbyterian kind of governance. And the president is sort of like an honorary role that rotates every year. And so this was his year elected as the president of the conference. And he was using his time as president to try to spread his vision of Methodism as a very socially engaged form of Christianity and trying to break down barriers and get people over their sort of suspicion of his ideas. And that's why he went to Southport, to his credit, because a lot of his colleagues who had similar views probably wouldn't have shown up there. But Southport, we could say, it was typical of conservative, traditional, small town, rural, and northern Methodism, right? So in England, there's a big division between south and north, especially London and everywhere else, basically. But the northern Methodists were more revivalistic, more traditional, more working class by this time. Lidgett is typical of more liberal, progressive, urban, and Southern Methodism. And I'll talk more about his background later. But as I say, to his credit, he showed up, and Chadwick, to his credit, received him very well. Samuel Chadwick was the chairman of the Southport Convention, and this was his report that he wrote after Lidgett had come. I must tell you what a grand time he had on the convention platform. He got wings to his feet as well as his soul, and he shouted and clapped his hands nearly as much as Mr. Ruth, whom I'd heard at an American camp meeting. It was simply delightful. He beat my longest address by 17 minutes. I don't want to know how long it was. And he might have gone on for another hour. Holiness is the grand theme for a preacher, and the president expounded the truth, extolled the Savior, and exalted in both with a rapture that thrilled and tingled to the fingertips. I tell you, we have had a great time. So if you read about Lidgett, you'd be surprised by this description because this is just not his style. He's a very erudite, sort of sophisticated kind of person. But he seemed to have won over Chadwick and some of the folks there, at least with his efforts. So Samuel Chadwick was, as I said, representative of holiness revivalism. And he and his colleagues, people like the people who would have gone to Southport, are often portrayed in Methodist history, British Methodist history, as anti-intellectual, as reluctant to tackle big questions, having low educational standards, fearful of change, and so forth and so on. And so they're sort of seen as these unsophisticated country cousins by a lot of the Methodist historians who have written since then. And these comments come from Lidgett's biographer. And frankly, if you read Lidgett's writing, he's picking up on some of the things that Lidgett kind of says, basically, about these folks. But Chadwick was not as he was not as simplistic as he may seem, and as we'll see, he had more depth to him than his critics uh, charged. But he did have sometimes a very strident style, and he put things bluntly, and so you can understand why people might take this view of him. And here's a representative quote of his thinking about social mission. And at this time, some of the Methodists were, intentionally using the word socialism to describe their understanding of politics and social engagement. And what they meant by socialism had various shades of meaning. It didn't necessarily mean what people might think socialism meant today. And there was a spectrum of views. And Lidgett was actually pretty moderate in this respect compared to some of his colleagues. But here was a bit of a rant from Chadwick about this. The purpose of modern socialism is to commit the church to its social propaganda. Jesus Christ is proclaimed as the high priest of socialism who came to abolish private property and fill the mouths of people with bread. Individual salvation and the cultivation of Christian virtue are relegated to positions of secondary importance. Spiritual realities are deemed of less importance than social conditions. But Christ's order is first spiritual and then social, first the individual and then society. We cannot reverse it and live. The social can only be attained through the spiritual, and society can never be reconstructed from without. It is not a system, but an organism, and social redemption can only come by individual regeneration. So you get, from that quote, you get the basics of Chadwick's approach to social mission, which I'll unpack as we go through. But it wasn't, as I say, as simplistic as it might seem. And he had more theological depth than people believe. So what I'm going to do throughout the presentation here is first present Lidgett's perspective, his theological agenda, which was focused on what he called the fatherhood of God. And the vision of holiness that came out of that was one of what he calls filial self-sacrifice. And I'll talk about the implications of this for social mission. And then the Bermondsey Settlement, which was a community that Lidgett founded and led for about 6 decades and sort of embodied his vision for social reform. And then I'll go to Chadwick and talk about his holiness spirituality, the way he thought about social mission. And then I'll talk about Cliff College, which was the community that Chadwick led for 20 years, and how it embodied his vision. And then I'll do some analysis at the end of the differences. So let's begin with John Scott Lidgett. As you can see, he lived an incredibly long life, 99 years. And he's been called by more than one person, perhaps the greatest Methodist since Wesley. Now, whether we agree with that or not, his achievements were actually quite staggering. He was a national church leader, both inside and outside of Methodism. He was, as I said, the president of the conference in 1909. He was elected again as the president of the conference when Methodists united in 1932. Most of the Methodist churches reunited, and he was chosen, which is indicative of his stature in Methodism. He was president of the National Evangelical Free Church Council. He was he had multiple hats like that, like national leadership roles. He's been called a member of the Methodist aristocracy, someone who was raised in sort of the inner circle of Methodism. His father's father was a wealthy ship owner, and then his father had a successful career in business in London. And so they were not really wealthy, but very comfortable, upper middle class. On his mother's side, his mother's grandfather was John Scott, who he's named after, who was president of the Methodist Conference twice. He founded Westminster College, which was a Methodist teacher training institution. And so he was raised in this, very devout, but very, very comfortable suburban London kind of atmosphere. And on his also on his father's side, his one of his aunts was married to uh, Percival Bunting, who was a grandson of Jabez Bunting, if you know British Methodist history, a dominant figure in that generation. But Percival Bunting was a barrister and a social activist. He went on to receive a knighthood in 1908, and and John Scott Lidgett tells of his childhood, sort of spending times in his uncle's home, where these famous social activists were coming through, public intellectuals, and so that's sort of the environment that he was raised in. And so he also served not only in all these church leadership roles, which were tremendous, but also he was a local politician. He served on the London City Council. He served on the Senate of the University of London, became vice chancellor, and at one point, and all this, and on top of all this, he was a prolific author. He wrote 19 books, innumerable articles, just a tremendous work. In addition to what he did in the Bermondsey Settlement, which I'll talk about later. So I love this quote from Rupert Davies, who said, "In the performance of these manifold duties, he must have come as near to ubiquity as anyone else in history." And that's sort of how I think when I read about all the things he's doing. I have no idea how he could have managed all of this. He certainly had a lot of privileges, but he did not waste any of them. He really obviously worked hard and was an incredibly dedicated person. So his theology centered on this concept of the spirit, the fatherhood of God, which sounds kind of generic, but you have to unpack it a bit. And it was first articulated in his book, The Spiritual Principle of the Atonement. His inspiration in this was Anglican mid 20th mid 19th century Anglican F.D. Morris, um, who's kind of a controversial figure. He draws very varied impressions. Some people think he was entirely orthodox, and some people think he was somewhat heretical. Probably wasn't heretical, I would say, but anyway, he was received in varied ways. But what Lidgett drew from him was a shift in terms of thinking about God from a sovereign ruler to a loving father. And so a real shift towards thinking about God primarily through the lens of fatherhood as a sort of controlling metaphor for how we think of God. And Lidgett applied this to the atonement and tried to reinterpret all the classic, theologies of the atonement, penal substitution, satisfaction, and he went through all the history of that. And he interpreted it as, really being about the son's what he called filial obedience, meaning his obedience as a son to a father, that was what was atoning in what Christ did. Wasn't the punishment per se that atoned for our sins, but it was the fact that Christ offered it as this obedient son. And this also shifted the emphasis on atonement from just being about the cross to being about the incarnation and the cross. So it was his whole life from beginning to end, and the obedience that he offered from beginning to end, that was this self-offering to the Father, offered on our behalf as our representative, that was consummated in the cross, but it really characterized his entire life. So this was controversial when it was first came out. He delivered the key chapter as the Fernley Lecture for 1897, and the Fernley Lecture was an academic lecture that took place at the Methodist Conference every year. It was a very high-profile event, and somebody, I don't know who, somebody tried to get it stopped from being published when they read the contents, because they thought he was underplaying the penal aspects of the atonement, underplaying the aspects of God's justice, and so forth and so on. But he had defenders who came to his aid, and within a few years, it was received as an important work. And indeed, it was sort of an older generation that was opposing him, and soon he became the leading voice and the leading light of Methodism, and his view came to dominate as the 20th century dawned. And this was expanded in two other books, which formed sort of a trilogy, what he considered his main theological contribution: The Fatherhood of God in Christian Truth and Life, and The Christian Religion, Its Meaning and Proof. And it became clear that this understanding of divine fatherhood wasn't just about atonement, but is basically about everything. It's about how we think about humanity, creation, spirituality, social progress, historical progress, even the nature of the universe, the nature of reality. So it was really sort of a unifying principle for him for everything. And here's a quote that gets at that point. This supreme fact, the fatherhood of God as revealed in Christ, was not only the highest truth of theology, but the practical principle divinely given and imminently real for the understanding of man and for the ordering of human life in all its relationships and concerns. And this fact revealed the essential constitution of the universe and should be the master light of all man's seeing, the guide of all his aspirations and endeavors. The incarnation made manifest the spiritual structure of the universe, revealed its originating motive and its final end, and became the governing idea upon which all human life should be based, unifying at once religious faith, moral conduct, and political activities. The sovereignty of love displaced the reign alike of force and fixity. So that's, you see that what he talked about, the shift from sovereignty to fatherhood there in that final quote, from love to reign. This is sort of what what's his guiding light in all of his theological writing. So there's a vision of holiness that emerges from this as what I said, filial self-offering, or the offering of a son, right, of the offering of obedience modeled after Christ. So sanctification is seen as the sanctification of life in the world rather than being set apart from the world, right? Since this is the principle of the whole universe, it's sort of like, and it has that more incarnational kind of emphasis, right? And entire sanctification was reframed then as not being so much about an inward perfection that bears fruit outwardly, but as about the sanctification of everything. Yes, inward life, but also outward behavior, life in the world, social relations, politics, business. It's about sanctifying everything. So he says, to be sanctified meant fullness of the consciousness of sonship, right? So again, it's being conformed to the likeness of Christ in that way of embodying sonship in the way Christ did, which was this life of self-surrender, right? So sanctification means being brought through self-surrender to realize those relations for which God claims him on the ground of creation and redemption. So God has already claimed us for this life of sonship in not only in redemption, but also in creation. And sanctification is realizing that in our life. And so here is a quote that gets at this move away from set apartness, we could say. We have to do, not in the last resort, not with abstract phrases about being set apart to God and the like, these have real meaning and suggestiveness, but with the substance contained in this setting apart and with the means by which it is effected. And from every quarter of the New Testament comes the answer that sonship is both the form and the power of a consecrated or sanctified life. So this reshapes also the way he thinks about church and the world. If holiness is not so much about being set apart from the world, neither is engagement with the world. There's more of a trying to transform the world from within, we could say. He wants to stress that the universality of divine fatherhood, and this is one of the things that gets the more evangelical and conservative people nervous about what he's saying. In some sense, he says all humanity is already under the divine fatherhood. God is the father of all. And he's against drawing a really hard distinction between the born again and the not born again, the regenerate and the unregenerate. He doesn't quite completely erase it, but he's undermining it, and he doesn't want it to be a hard distinction. So Christians who are already sort of included in this divine sonship and fully conscious of it and being conformed to it should nevertheless see themselves as part of a universal brotherhood that extends beyond the boundaries of the church. The church is distinctive but not exclusive in his view. And he even uses the language of one body to refer to humanity. Humanity is one body, and destined to become sort of more fully one body, right? So the church is not to be understood as isolated from mankind, called to cultivate apartness and separation. The church, by the very reason of the wholeness of its life, must be frankly and fully human in order to become the comprehensive ideal. So the church is trying to sort of envelop all peoples, but also all of life into its life in order to sort of sanctify all things, right? And now this, to be clear, is not, a sentimental appeal to brotherhood. It does have Lidgett has deep Christological grounding for what he's saying. And he mostly dwells on that. He mostly dwells on Christological and Trinitarian issues. And then eventually he comes to sort of the implications and the social implications of it. It's universal. The fatherhood is universal because it's revealed in Christ and in the universality of the incarnation, that Christ represents all people, but also in the cross, which atones for the sins of all people. So social progress then for Chadwick, not for Chadwick, for Lidgett rather, comes not through acting in self-interest, which is the basis of capitalism, but in this Christoform self-offering of love for all humankind, which is where he comes to advocating for more something like socialism, right? That's what the ideal should be. And he constantly, so he gets there, and some of his fellow travelers in the more liberal branches of British Methodism go much further than him in taking up these themes and running with them and advocating for like nationalization of industries and things like this that you would associate with socialism. Lidgett doesn't really, he tries to stay moderate, and he tries to continually present social reform in a Christocentric way, right? So he says the keener apprehension of spiritual relationships may even lead some Christian men to concentrate their efforts upon political and economic reform or upon the improvement of the general environment of people in order to make the conditions of their life more favorable to and in accordance with the reception of the mind of Christ. So this is what he's saying there is there's this idea that if we can create social progress in and of itself, improve the conditions of people, that might make them more receptive to the gospel. That's what he's saying. And he's saying some people might just focus more on that side of it, just the social progress side. But then he does add this, but ultimately the regeneration of individuals and the practical authority of the revelation of Christ are the essence of human progress, and all else is important as expressing or facilitating these through the whole range of human nature and among all races and classes of men. So he's trying to keep regeneration at the center, but he's trying to relativize it somewhat as sort of the lodestar of Christian mission. So let's talk a bit about then the Bermondsey Settlement and how it embodied these ideas that Lidgett was advocating for. He founded it in 1891, and it was part of a broader movement of what are called settlement houses. It's similar to what I've heard of in more recent history, the move-in movement, I think it's called. I can't remember. People who move into poor neighborhoods to try to plant churches by actually living there, right? And this was a similar idea, but it started in the 1880s. Toynbee Hall was the first one, founded by Anglican priest and his wife, Samuel and Henrietta Barnett, who had a parish in East London. And then many colleges from Oxford and Cambridge started to get involved. So Keble College, which was a Tractarian college, named after the Oxford movement, they founded Oxford Hall, and that had a more explicit sort of religious foundation to it, and it became a model for many others. And these spread, not just in London, but there was many of them in other parts of the UK and certainly in America. I'm not sure if there were some in Canada. There probably were. But the aim was to take young university students and maybe recent graduates and to get them to move into these communities in poor neighborhoods and to try to bring social change by living there, being part of the community, being a good neighbor, getting to know people, and getting involved with things that were happening. And so it was mostly inspired by these Christian socialist ideals that came from F.D. Morris, who I mentioned earlier, but there were others associated with him. Charles Kingsley was another important name. So the Bermondsey Settlement was, as I say, modeled on these. And this is where Bermondsey is in London on the right side of the bottom right side of the map here. And this is obviously a contemporary map of London. but it's very much within sort of central London, you could say. This map contains most of the main attractions in London. You know, the Tower of London is here, St. Paul's Cathedral, Houses of Parliament, Covent Garden, and just a little further off to the west is Buckingham Palace. And so it's very much in that mix. And just to the north, you'll see Whitechapel, on the other side of the river, which is, of course, a famous East End London neighborhood that was known for its extreme poverty, and the place where Jack the Ripper was active right around this time, just shortly before um, Lidgett founds the Bermondsey Settlement. So it's urban poverty, and Lidgett believed that Bermondsey had similar levels of need to places like Whitechapel, but didn't have the profile, wasn't getting as much attention from the churches and other agencies. So how did he conceive it? It was to be a community of social workers, this is his words, who come to a poor neighborhood to assist by the methods of friendship and cooperation those who are concerned in upholding all that is essential to the well-being of the neighborhood. So, apologize for the American spelling there. That's very wrong of me, especially at this time. I'll fix that. So, but it was a so it's this social kind of social work um, foundation, right? And again, moving into the neighborhood, cooperation, friendship, establishing relationships, and working with people who are already working there, right? And he had listed off a sixfold purpose to bring an additional force and attractiveness to Christian work, to become a center of social life where all classes may meet together on equal terms for healthful intercourse and recreation, to give facilities for the study of literature, history, science, and art, to bring men together to discuss general and special social evils and to seek their remedy, to take such part in local administration and philanthropy as may be possible, and so to do all this that it should be perfectly clear that no mere sectarian advantage is sought, but that it shall be possible for all good men to associate themselves with our work. So that last point was about this was not a Methodist exclusive initiative. People from other denominations could take part. They didn't have to become part of the Methodist Church to be involved with it. And I'll talk a little more about what that meant later. So the activities were primarily educational, as you would see from that list. Um, and there were university extension courses, a lot of musical programming, gymnastics, elocution, dressmaking, school for mothers, elementary science. So just a broad general education kind of agenda, almost we could say maybe a civilizing agenda in perhaps a bit of a patronizing way. And included also the other things like nursing work. There was a women's house that was established nearby. The men lived in the actual Bermondsey Settlement building. And they became responsible for nursing in that whole district. They had temperance, different kinds of temperance initiatives. They ran an insurance company. They had gave out free legal advice. So just like a wide variety of things they were involved in. And the image here, it's not the greatest quality, but it's a representative of the kind of programming they were running. You know, people having a music theory lesson in the drawing room of the settlement. So you can see it's as I say, a kind of a very civilized kind of trying to educate the population, trying to expose people to things that they weren't have a chance to be exposed to in those times because education was not available to everybody. And here's another interesting one, a picture exhibition. And so this is basically like setting up a temporary art gallery for the public to come and view for free. And this actually, and he tells a story. He really reveled in the story of this. I don't think it was this particular exhibition, but one of them that he had the Princess Louise come and open. So this is one of Queen Victoria's daughters, who actually came with her husband to Canada for several years. He was the Governor General, the Duke of Argyll, the Governor General of Canada, for a few years, and Lake Louise named after her. Alberta is named after her. That's her third name. But anyway, he's having a picture exhibition and having royalty come to open it, right? Another one that he had took pride in was a performance of Handel's oratorio Judas Maccabeus, right? So it's sort of like a Handel's Messiah, kind of that kind of musical piece that they were putting on a performance of. So fairly high level of education going on through these activities. But as you might imagine, it was criticized as being not sufficiently religious, right? This seems like this is just secular education. Why would we be doing this? And because he had this non-sectarian kind of aim, I suppose, I'm not exactly sure if this is why, it didn't really have any Christian formation program involved with the settlement itself. It didn't have a chapel, didn't have chapel services. Now, Lidgett himself was involved in a lot of local Methodist ministry, and a lot of the people would have been, but it wasn't part of the work of the settlement itself, right? He claimed that religious work was the prime activity, but when he described that, he just listed off all the things he personally did, not so much the work of the settlement. But um, there was a different way of thinking that underlied it, right? As you saw from his vision of the fatherhood of God and how it expanded out to be thinking about social and political issues. So he would have tried to frame even those seemingly secular educational activities as spiritual, right? As religious. And there's a quote here from one of his former residents, William Lofthouse, that says just that. Religion means more than holding of services and meetings on church premises. Okay, now let's talk about Samuel Chadwick. Um, so he was a leading evangelist and holiness revivalist. He was born and raised in Burnley, industrial town north of Manchester. He went to a very different background to Lidgett. He was also raised in a devout Methodist home, but he started working in a cotton mill at age 8 years old and stayed there till he was 21. So he had very little formal schooling as a child, but he felt called in his teens to ministry and started doing some lay preaching, and then was given a chance to work as a lay evangelist for a couple of years in a nearby town. And that got him into Didsbury College, which was one of the Methodist theological colleges in Manchester, and got him into the Methodist ministry. He had various appointments. He had a long tenure at Oxford Place Mission in Leeds, which was also a kind of inner city home, what they would have called a home mission model, which was more common than the Bermondsey Settlement. It had, would have had evangelistic activities as well as various social kind of initiatives, and those were all over the place. But then he came to Cliff College, first as a tutor, and then became the principal in 1912 and stayed in that role until his death. Like Lidgett, he couldn't hold a candle to Lidgett in terms of all the kind of roles he had, but he was the president of the Wesleyan Methodist Conference. He was the president of the National Free Church Council. So he had similar kind of national profile, although not on the same level. So his thinking about holiness, and I'll move through this maybe a little more quickly because it's maybe a little more familiar. He was aligned with the Holiness Movement. He was a revivalist at heart. He thought revival of holiness was the church's greatest need. He was focused on Pentecost, both as a historical event, but also as an event in the life of the believer, the descent of the Spirit, the baptism of the Spirit, and what that could release in the believer's life. He had a dispensational view of the Spirit's work. And by this, I don't mean premillennial dispensational eschatology. I'm just saying it's an emphasis on the difference between the Spirit's work pre and post Pentecost, that something radical happened at Pentecost that opened a new dimension of the Spirit's work in the lives of people. And also taught Christian perfection or entire sanctification as a second work of grace, which was a hallmark of holiness teaching. However, he had a lot of depth to him. When you read, especially his writings beyond his holiness writings, he wrote on a whole bunch of different topics. He was editor of a newspaper for 25 years, and he wrote one or two articles a week. And there were thousands of articles he wrote on a whole wide range of theological issues, social issues, political issues. And he often wrote multi-part series, like he did a 15-part series on ecclesiology one time. And it's quite, as I say, quite well balanced. It's not just revivalist stuff. He's engaging classical issues of ecclesiology. And he tried to keep up with current debates and scholarship, even though he was largely self-taught, up to his up till he got to Didsbury College. And he had, we could call, a Catholic streak that blunted some of the sectarian tendencies of the Holiness Movement. So he was genuinely appreciative of more historical forms of spirituality, of insights from people outside of his own sort of circle, and even in a kind of odd way. And I'll mention this later again, but he used sometimes Catholic terminology. He called his Cliff College evangelists friars. Um, but he also did things like preaching the church year, which was not common in these kind of circles at that time. So anyway, a very interesting guy, which is why I'm still talking about him after I finish that book, because I still find him interesting. He wasn't unconcerned with social conditions. As I said, he knew poverty. He lived it in a way that Lidgett never had. But he was really worried that fixation on societal issues and political action by the church itself would distort the gospel and end up making the church and the gospel subservient to a social agenda. So here's a representative quote about social issues in the church that shows you that he wasn't unconcerned with these things. I yield to no man the social implications of the gospel. Christ's ministry was social. The program he announced at Nazareth was concerned with the poor and underprivileged, the captives and the crushed, the burdened and the oppressed. He did not organize against social systems, though. So he did not organize against social systems. He preached and delivered, healed and saved. He organized his church on truth and grace. Its members were to be born again Christians. Its discipline was to be in the atmosphere of prayer and under the direction of the Holy Spirit. No Christian can be indifferent to suffering and misery, disability and oppression, affliction and sorrow, and no church is Christian that ignores social unrighteousness and distress. But Christ is no mere social reformer. He is the Savior of the world. Um, so you'll see the emphasis on sort of personal piety that he thinks is really important, the emphasis on new birth, regeneration, that he's trying to stress there in response to what some of his colleagues like Lidgett are doing. And, saying all of this is good, but at the end of the day, it's not ultimately the hope of the world. So what were his reasons for concern? As I just mentioned, first of all, the need for personal regeneration, right? He stresses this over and over that being born again is essential in classic evangelical style. But even then, his concerns were not narrowly individualistic and they were not narrowly pietistic. And he had a deeper understanding of theological anthropology. He stressed being created in the image of God involved the vice-regal role of exercising dominion, as we see in Genesis 1, and that it has social and political implications. So he did think humanity had this calling to exercise dominion and justly establish God's order in the world, but that this had been fatally compromised by sin, and that only new birth could restore humanity to that proper role and therefore bring about social change. So here's again a quote that represents this view. By faith in Christ, man's sovereignty in the world is to be restored. The world is in chaos because man is discrowned. The whole creation groaneth and travaileth, waiting for the revealing of the sons of God. So the end of redemption is a new social order, but established through a new and redeemed humanity. So what he's saying here, in this language of being crowned, discrowned, man exercising sovereignty, this seems very offensive to most people today. It seems very anthropocentric, but it is a biblical theme, not just in Genesis 1, which invites us to exercise dominion on God's behalf as stewards, but also there's eschatological themes that we will one day reign with Christ. So some contemporary biblical theology, supports this. In my course on creation stewardship, we explore this theme. So he's on solid ground in some of what he's saying here for sure. Secondly, this leads to a divine order. There's a relationship, spiritual it comes before social, right? Social church may be prayerless and Christless, but a spiritual church saves the soul and abounds in ministry to social needs. So, in other words, he could say the social side is the fruit of the change that comes through conversion and not the foundation. So this led to a clearer demarcation between the mission of the church as a church and the vocation of individual Christians in the world. So the church's mission from Chadwick's perspective is to raise up saints through worship, teaching, discipleship, fellowship, and to make these people into godly people who are therefore godly citizens. And then those godly citizens are to go out into the world and address social problems through various kind of ways. Some of them are going to be teachers or lawyers or doctors or factory workers or whatever. But the church does the raising up saints part, and then those people go out into other institutions to address those social problems. Also, he wanted a really clear demarcation between the church and the state. And he saw them as potentially working together, but he was very nervous that some of what he saw, the social sort of initiatives of some of his colleagues, were perhaps taking functions of the state into the church. And he thought this was going to be disastrous for both the church and the state. The church shouldn't control the state shouldn't, be controlling the church or either, right? So he wanted this really clear line between the two of them. So I won't go through everything on this slide, but you know what he says. The work of the church is not to control states, but to make citizens, not to be political, but to produce politicians, not work organizations, but promote righteousness. And then finally, and then I'll move on to Cliff College in a moment here, wanted a strong distinction between the church and the world. So this is more the traditional holiness being set apart from the world emphasis, right? And he thought this was essential and worried that it was being blurred, that the social emphasis that he saw in other Methodists at the time wasn't just a changed attitude and overemphasis on social problems, but that there was an underlying change in the way that people were relating to the world, and that they were losing that sense of distinction and set apartness. So what he says is, what's needed is a Christianity that renounces the world and yet remains in it, comes out from it, and then goes back to change it, separates it from it and condemns it, but then convicts and converts it, right? So this emphasis on being set apart in order to go back and make change. So Cliff College sort of was an expression of, Chadwick didn't invent Cliff College, but there's a fitting kind of, there's a fitness, we could say, between his vision of holiness and separation from the world and mission and Cliff College itself. Now it was an institute for lay evangelists, began as the Joyful News Training Home and Mission, founded as an independent evangelistic agency, revivalist agency. It moved to its current location in the Peak District in 1904, and at that time was sort of taken into the operations of the Wesleyan Methodist Church as a place to train missionaries, home missionaries and foreign missionaries, who they were not ordained, but they were, evangelistic workers both at home and abroad. So here, if you remember the map that I showed you of London, where the Bermondsey Settlement was, right in the heart of the urban context, Cliff College is in a very rural and idyllic kind of setting. The Peak District is it's actually a very beautiful place. A lot of English holiday makers would go there to get away from the city. A lot of vacation homes today and that sort of thing, surrounded by farms and just beautiful landscape, rolling hills and cliffs and so on. So a very different, coming out of the city, coming out, being apart from all those kind of involvements. So this rural setting fit the paradigm of Chadwick's theology, coming apart from the world for intensive formation, and then in order to go back into the world and to spread the gospel. So the typical activities were a curriculum, of course, of lectures on Bible, theology, evangelism, homiletics, but they also needed to do things like English grammar and literature, because most of the folks who came to this place didn't have they would be like Chadwick. They didn't have other formal education. And actually, they could just pay whatever they could afford. There was no set fee, um, so that no one would be prevented from coming who had a genuine calling. So they would take people in who wouldn't be able to qualify maybe for other educational institutions based on their background. So they had that curriculum. It was, of course, set within more of a program of Christian formation, piety, personal piety and discipline, as well as a vibrant church, a chapel life. They also did evangelistic campaigns training, which they called treks. And as I said, Chadwick sometimes cast the evangelists as friars. They would just go out like walking for long distances from town to town, doing evangelism or taking carts and things like this. They also ran summer schools, programs open to the broader church, and what they called festivals, which were more like, camp meetings, conventions, that sort of thing. Um, here's a what they would call the gospel van. So this is the kind of thing they would take out on their treks, right? Um, a but they put all their stuff in there. They could go out to different towns and set up and do evangelistic campaigns. Um, it's just an interesting contrast, right, from the picture exhibition, the performance of Handel oratorio, and then you have this other expression of mission, which is, very in your face, putting bold letters on the side, of a van that you carry around to really grab people's attention. That's sort of the style they were, aggressive evangelism, revivalism was the kind of things they were doing. Okay, so there's obvious contrasts, right? I just mentioned the picture exhibition versus the gospel van, the urban versus rural locations, very different. The activities, you've got a piety-focused curriculum at Cliff College versus this sort of broad educational agenda at the Bermondsey Settlement. Um, but beneath that, what I'm mostly interested in is how did they get to that point? There's different convictions here about human nature and especially about sin. Chadwick has a much stronger, more traditional Protestant doctrine of sin that, needs to be addressed through regeneration, right? Before there's any hope of sort of social reform. So he has that priority on personal before social reform. And then the level of distinction between church and world, Christ and culture, church and state, very different kind of attitudes towards the world that grow out of these theological convictions. Lidgett has this idea that we can just be part of the world and transform it from within. Chadwick has more the sense of being set apart in order to go back and transform. Um, so just in closing, then, who's backward and who's forward here? The uh, Chadwick's critics and a lot of the historians, as I said, in the 20th century, portray him as backward looking, as kind of stuck in the past and not open to the new thing that needed to happen. But most of those commentators basically share Lidgett's more liberal Protestant assumptions and worldview that, well, even the very idea that theology needs to be up to date, right, is more of a liberal Protestant assumption. Um, Chadwick's concerns weren't as reactionary as they seem, and they weren't a reflection of narrow late 19th century holiness viewpoints only. Now, he certainly had that, things like holiness as a second work of grace, but he also was very rooted in classical orthodoxy, and this comes through in his writings, and in ways that actually weather much better than Lidgett's more experimental kind of ideas that very much are a product of their time and seem that way when you read them today. And also, I would say the prioritizing of personal over social reform is not a 19th century, not just a holiness movement thing, but it's a broader tradition that stretches back certainly to Wesley, but arguably even back to the church fathers. And I've done some reading on that. And this idea that reform begins with the individual transformation has deep roots in Christian history. So I would say it's not so much about Chadwick being backward and Lidgett being forward-looking, but that Chadwick represented more historical views and Lidgett more revisionist.